are threads on the end. If the 911 has the original wires that it came with, you will need to install the threaded cap that goes over here. If you don't, you'll end up pulling the plugs back out and doing it. You may have to transfer the threaded cup off of the former set of plugs onto the new plugs. Take the new plug out of the box. You should take off some type of a protective device. And we'll want to check the gap before we install it. It's very possible that the gap is correct. However, you can never take that for granted. This little device here is a very smooth, quick method of setting a plug gap. As you can see, it's calibrated on this side in decimal inch and on this side in metric. The plug gap specification for this specific plug is 0.8 millimeters or 32 thousandths of an inch. The gap gauge is variably thick. We slip the gauge in between the center and the side electrode, and we roll it up to where we hit resistance, and then that is our measurement. In this case, we're slightly over. We'd want to remove the gap gauge, tap gently on the side electrode, or push gently, and recheck the setting. If the plug gap is too small, rock the gauge back and forth until you can obtain the desired specification. Once that's completed, we want to put a small drop of oil on the threads in the center, and the plug is ready to be installed. Here we have a little bit different style of plug gapping tool. This is an older gauge and often is referred to as a more reliable gauge. Once again, we're after a 32 thousandths gap. We'll take the 32 thousandths feeler, and it just pulls through nicely. This plug is gapped correctly. If it were not, on the other end is this little device. It can be used to pry on the side electrode to either reduce the clearance by prying in or increase the clearance by prying out. And after you've done that, once again, recheck your gap. Little drop of oil, and you're ready to install this plug.
This unit is the air compressor for the air conditioning. You'll need to remove the mounting bolts securing the unit on both the back and the front. The front bolts are just a little bit hidden. Once the tension has been released, you can then slip the fan belt off, enabling you to move the compressor. Lay a towel on the fender and place the unit on the towel. This gives you access to the right bank valve cover.
To replace the air filter on this fuel-injected 911, we release the rubber band holders over the filter holder and lift the filter out. You probably will prefer to remove this portion of the filter and set it aside before doing your valve adjustment and your plug replacement. And after you've completed both the valve adjustment and the plug replacement, then you'll want to inspect and probably replace the air filter. As you can see, this vehicle has an updated air filtration system. The original paper air filtration system has been replaced by these foam oil type filters. To service this system, we simply remove the spring clips all the way around, lift the cap off, then this foam element will slip up off. We wash it in hot soapy water, rinse it in hot water, shake it dry, squeeze a small amount of oil into it, squeeze the oil into the element and slip the element back in place, rehooking the clips. All right, now we're ready to start taking off some valve covers for the valve adjustment. We'll start with the left lower valve cover. It's kind of important due to the thinness of the alloy on the valve cover that we start on one end or the other end, break these nuts loose, then go up to this end, then here, then here. We work from either end towards the center. That way, if it's a little bit warm, we avoid any possibility of warping the valve cover. Just break them loose first, and then once they're all broken loose, then you can come back and loosen them the rest of the way and drop the valve cover. There's quite a few nuts here, so it will take you a few minutes. There's no reason to hurry. Just take your time and this nice tool here is what we call a wobble-headed socket. It's a 13 millimeter. And it gives us lots of variabilities, both with the socket as well as the ratchet. Here's the last nut. And now we can start really making some headway, taking off our nuts. It's advisable to have a pan underneath here because you will lose a slight amount of oil when the valve cover comes off. Now that we've gotten all the nuts and the washers off of the valve cover, we'll want to go ahead and just pull it off. Sometimes these are stuck, sometimes they're nice and loose. Now do you see why we want the pan underneath to catch that little bit of oil? And there's the valve train. There's the beauty of this engine. It's a system that's been used for well over 20 years now, but it still has its place in the Grand Prix circuit. In order to adjust the valves, it's important to know which cylinder you are on. In the distributor is a mark that indicates number 1 cylinder. We have the distributor rotor pointing at this mark right here, which indicates top dead center of number 1. We then need to come over to the crankshaft pulley by using a ratchet or a wrench on the fan pulley. You want to turn in a clockwise direction only. You may have to add some tension to the fan belt to turn the engine. There's 3 marks on the flywheel. Locate our timing marks there and correspond them with the notch on the fan housing. We are at top dead center, number 1 cylinder now, and can adjust intake and exhaust valve of number 1 cylinder.
We'll show you this procedure a couple more times before we demonstrate the actual valve adjustment. Turn the flywheel 120 degrees so the next mark lines up with the fixed mark. Here's the mark coming up. The timing mark is now lined up with the fixed mark, and you're ready to adjust the number 6 cylinder.
Having adjusted the number 6 valve, we're ready to continue to the next valve in the sequence. We need to advance to the next cylinder, which in this case will be number 2.
The marks are now lined up, so let's go to the valve adjustment for cylinder number 2.
Now that we've got number 2 cylinder set up on top dead center, we're ready to adjust the number 2 exhaust valve. We can see that we have exhaust play here. That's just to confirm that we're on number 2. Take and loosen the lock nut. We have here a special little tool. It's a feeler gauge holder. It's nice and small so that you can get it in between what's called the elephant foot and the head of the valve. Because of this design with the elephant foot, it's almost impossible to just check the clearance. So we're going to just go ahead and set it. Slip the feeler gauge in. Using either your finger or a screwdriver, you tighten up the adjusting screw so that there is no slack. You shouldn't be able to rock the rocker arm and have it convey movement to this feeler gauge holder. But at the same time, we should be able to move the feeler gauge back and forth. We should have that nice light magnetic drag type of feeling, which I believe are just right. We remove the excessive, what we'd call slack, on the lock nut, and we're ready to tighten the lock nut back up. If you have a lock nut that's kind of stodgy, and you start to turn it, and that turns the adjusting nut as well, then you'll need to have another screwdriver to reach up in and hold the adjusting nut itself while we're tightening up the lock nut. Once again, we don't want to be terribly tight. We don't want this to come loose. So we need to put a fair amount of stress on it, about like that. Once again, we check. No movement in our feeler gauge. We still have movement back and forth. And we'll go ahead and ease the feeler gauge out. And we have our valve adjustment on number 2 exhaust valve. In order to adjust the intake valves, we have to take off the intake valve cover, which is the upper one. We've already removed the plugs, taken them out of the way. Once again, we want to start on either end. Break the nut loose, loosen them up a little ways to where we can then go back, completely remove them. Once again, this is so if you have a slightly warm engine, you reduce the risk of warping a valve cover. Be careful when you're taking these off. It's possible to drop the nut down into the spark plug hole. Once you've taken off all the nuts and the upper washers so that they won't fall in somewhere, then you can take off the upper gasket and the cover. And there's the gasket. Now that we have the intake valve cover off, you can see the 3 intake valve stems, and we can proceed with adjusting them. We're in number 2, top dead center. Once again, because of the elephant's foot, we can't truly check it. We must just adjust it. Break the locking nut loose, unscrew the adjuster, get to where we have some slack, need to feed in the feeler gauge holder in between. This is something that you'll have to do more by feel than by sight. The intake valves are more difficult to adjust than the exhaust. Once you've got the feeler gauge in the position underneath the elephant's foot, you want to snug up the adjusting screw, finger tight, pressing on the rocker